Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. Hi, my name is Kevin Wong and I'm the director of the Desert Institute at Joshua Tree National Park, which is the educational program of the Joshua Tree National Park Association. With me is Lara Roselle of the National Park Service, who originally proposed a series of webinars to train park staff on park-specific topics while they are working remotely during this pandemic. We will be your hosts and the producers of these webinars. Before I get started, I'd like to offer some tips on how to use this webinar effectively. As internet bandwidth is heavily used in California due to the stay-at-home direction, and so many of us are working remotely, we may have issues with internet connection. If you have audio or monitor issues during this webinar, it may be due to having too many programs open on your computer, including email or Facebook, which have regular updates. These will reduce your access to bandwidth. In addition, when the webinar begins, you will see a small control panel on your screen, generally in the upper right corner. There is a question mark and a dialog balloon. If you click on the question mark, you can ask questions that we will present to the speaker during his presentation. We will also be able to unmute the audience at the end of the presentation so that you can ask questions directly. Please try not to ask all of your questions at the same time. Unmute or type in the question instructions are only for those listening live, or conversely, disregard instructions if you are watching this on YouTube. At this time, we will begin. Today's presentation is Amazing Desert Insects with Kurt Leuschner. Kurt, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me. Hope you all can hear me. We're going to talk bugs today. Not all arthropods, as you may know, are insects, so that's why the title here is Desert Insects and Other Arthropods, so we can talk about a wide range of bugs, but mostly insects we'll talk about. So let's get started with some non-insect arthropods of note that are in our desert area, including Joshua Tree, a black widow spider you're probably familiar with. Most spiders are not dangerous to humans, but the black widow is one of just a couple that can be. You've probably seen the females. They're pretty conspicuous, the red hourglass on the underside of their abdomen. The males, though, as you can see in the lower right, are a little less obvious. They're smaller, they're brownish with a little pattern on their abdomen, and they look a lot like other spiders. Now, a recent arrival into Southern California, well, recent in the last 20 years, is the brown widow. So this is something to watch for. I'm not sure if they've reached Joshua Tree yet, but I'm guessing they probably have. So if you live in the 29 Palms area, the town of Joshua Tree, this is a spider you'd probably look for under a garbage can lid or a barbecue cover when you take it off after you haven't used it in a while. This is the kind of areas you'll find the brown widow. They're not as attracted to moist areas like the black widow is. So you'll find it in some drier areas, lawn furniture, stuff like that. They also have kind of an orange-red hourglass, as you can see underneath their abdomen. Their venom is supposedly not quite as toxic as a black widow, but still one you would want to try to avoid being bitten by. Watch for it, the brown widow. Now remember, a lot of spiders are brown, so you can't just assume any brown spider you see is a brown widow, or for that matter, a brown recluse. So maybe you've heard of the brown recluse. This is the third dangerous spider in the West. In this case, the brown recluse technically doesn't occur in California. You can see it occurs over near Missouri in that green zone. Here in the Southwest, we have a close relative, which probably is just as venomous as a brown recluse, and ours is called the desert recluse. So again, most spiders are small and brown. You can't assume they're brown recluses. If you were to turn the brown recluse over, if you look in the lower left there, there's a pattern on the underside that supposedly resembles a violin. So it's also called the violin spider. But it's kind of hard to get these spiders to turn over and give you a good look at them. So something to be aware of. They're not common, but we do have the desert recluse, but technically not the brown recluse. Here's a spider you'll see in Joshua Tree. Talked about this actually in our bird migration PowerPoint. Desert tarantula, which are mostly seen in September, October, November. The males are the ones we usually see. The females hide in their burrows. They can bite, but they're not very aggressive at all, so they're not likely to bite, and it probably wouldn't provoke much of a reaction with most people if you were to be bitten. Scorpions are arthropods, and one of our common species is the desert hairy scorpion, which tends to be a fairly large, robust scorpion. Their sting is similar to a bee sting. Some people are more reactive than others to that, but it's not considered to be dangerous. All scorpions, regardless of the species, will glow under ultraviolet light, like this one is glowing. I took this photo at the Desert Studies Center. Another scorpion in our area, I don't think it's reached Joshua Tree yet, and hopefully it won't, but it has reached the Coachella Valleys, the bark scorpion. This one also is slightly dangerous. Its venom is more toxic than your average scorpion. They're thinner, they're associated with trees and wood debris. We're starting to see these in the area around Indio, Thermal, Coachella. So they're kind of finding their way into the eastern Coachella Valley. So something to keep on our radar, but probably not in Joshua Tree yet. This is a weird looking critter that might remind you of a scorpion. For some reason, people want to call these vinegaroons, but they're not. A real vinegaroon is what you see in the lower right there. This critter is called a wind scorpion. It's related to scorpions, but it has no stinger, as you can see. It's also sometimes called a sun spider, although it's not a true spider either. Camel spider is another nickname. Some people call them sulpugids, although technically sulpugids only occur in Africa. That's a family that doesn't occur here. All of these things are in the order Solifugi, so you could call them a solifugid. You could call them an arymbatid, which is the family that they're in. Call them whatever you want, but just don't call them a vinegaroon. We don't have any vinegaroons in the desert region here, and also not in Joshua Tree that I know of. If you do see a vinegaroon, report it to iNaturalist, report it to me. We'd love to be able to document that. The nearest records are right along the border near Mexicali and Calexico. If you go over to Arizona, then you can see vinegaroons like the one in the lower right there, Tucson area. Vinegaroons are also related to scorpions. They're called whip scorpions because their tail is like a little whip, has no stinger on it though. And if they are crushed, they smell like acetic acid or vinegar, and that's how they got the nickname vinegaroon. But they're essentially harmless. Okay, insects. Antlions occur in the area. They're common at porch lights at night, especially this time of the year, so watch for them. The adults look kind of like a floppy-winged damselfly. The young, which are called doodle bugs, live under the ground, and they construct these inverted cones. They wait at the base of the cone for an unsuspecting ant to fall in, and then they gobble them up. So you'll see these cones in sandy areas where the sand is and the soil is just the right consistency. They'll often construct a new one every morning. Just takes them a few minutes, I think, to make one. and then they lie in wait for ants to fall in, hence the name antlion. So the young, which can live for a couple of years doing this, are very different than the adults, as you can see. These are insects. They've got 6 legs. Another common insect that's coming out now in good numbers is the green lacewing. So you'll find these in shrubbery, and they like to eat aphids. So they're good to have around. They're a form of natural pest control. So we want to encourage the green lacewings. Look for these at porch lights at night. Honeybees are out and about. We've got both of these are non-native. Even the European honeybee, which is so common, is actually non-native, brought over during the time of the Pilgrims, the 1600s. We use honeybees to help pollinate our crops, and also, of course, to produce honey. So they're very useful to humans, but they are native to Europe. In more recent times, a more aggressive subspecies, the Africanized honeybee, has arrived in the desert Southwest, where it's here to stay. Just like regular honeybees, they look identical to them. They can only sting you once, but they tend to be more aggressive, so they're more apt to sting you in mass all at once. So just use common sense and keep away from any kind of swarm or hive of honeybees. A lot of our honeybees in the area are hybrids in between the non-aggressive European and the more aggressive Africanized. Carpenter bees are one of the first insects to come out in spring. So usually you see the females, which are all black and huge. Occasionally you'll see the males, especially early in the spring, kind of a golden color. Maybe 1 out of every 50 might be a male. Only the females can sting, because stingers are modified ovipositors, so only the females have them. They're called carpenter bees because they like to chew wood and chew holes in wood to lay their eggs in. So that's why you'll see them buzzing around the eaves of your house, or buzzing around an old agave stalk, for example, looking for a soft spot where they can chew a hole to lay their eggs in. Carpenter bees. They can sting the females, but they're not likely to. They're non-aggressive. Other native bees that are non-aggressive and not likely to sting you, but could if they wanted to, include the leafcutter bee. This is the one that will cut little half circles, semicircles out of certain leaves in your garden. So if you notice little circles missing out of the leaves, that's the work of the leafcutter bee. They're going to take those leaves and they're going to line their nesting cavities with those leaves. It makes the nesting cavity a softer place for its young to develop in. So they're looking for holes where they can lay their eggs in. Speaking of holes, this is a bee house. So if you want to encourage native bees, like the leafcutter bee, like the carpenter bee, like the digger bees in some cases, or the cuckoo bees, you could construct a bee house like this one. Now, some bees are looking for cavities or holes to nest in, like leafcutter bees. Other, like the digger bees, are going to want to nest in the ground and dig into the ground. So they're probably not going to use your bee house. But if you do make one of these bee houses, make sure you use untreated wood. That's very important. Make sure you don't drill through all the way to the other side. Drill as deep as you can and vary the depth anywhere from 2 to 5 inches. That's why I like to use pieces of 4x6, because they've got a 6-inch length. You can go in 4 or 5 inches without poking through the other end. Now you may ask what size hole is preferable. I've found through trial and error that 1/4 inch is a very popular one. So I'd say use a lot of 1/4 inch holes and then mix it up with some slightly larger and some slightly smaller ones. Carpenter bees apparently like to make their own holes, but occasionally they will use pre-drilled holes as well. Some of the lazy carpenter bees will do that. Tarantula hawks are these huge wasps you'll start to see flying around all spring, and they're looking for spiders, especially tarantulas, to paralyze. And when the female finds one, she'll sting it and paralyze it, and she'll dig a hole in the ground and stuff the paralyzed spider inside, lay an egg, often just a single egg, and that egg will hatch and have fresh meat to eat as it devours the helpless but still alive tarantula inside the hole. Mud dauber wasps are members of the thread-waisted wasps. You can kind of see why they're called thread-waisted when you see how thin that area of their body is. They will be around your swimming pools and water holes, collecting mud and water so that they can construct this organ pipe kind of formation that you see in the lower right. Inside this mud formation, they will stuff small paralyzed spiders. So it's kind of a smaller version of the tarantula hawk story I just told you about. And they'll lay a few eggs in there, and then the eggs will hatch and they'll feast on the paralyzed spiders and other insects that are stuffed into those holes. This particular wasp, also in the same family, Sphaecidae, actually took a class in ceramics and constructs these little oyas and attaches them to things like your screen door or screens on your window or your lawn furniture. So look for these little mud pots stuck here, there, and everywhere. And inside the pots, once again, the spider will stuff paralyzed, the wasp will stuff paralyzed spiders for their young to eat. Potter wasp. We've got a lot of ants around. You can't help but notice them. Most of our ants in the desert and in Joshua Tree, for example, are what we might call harvester ants. Harvester ant is a general term for ants that harvest food, plant material. So they're harvesting seeds, they're harvesting plant parts, they're harvesting parts of leaves, and they're going to actually feed on this plant material, or their young are also going to be fed kind of a regurgitated plant material. So they're busy harvesting during the day. There's different genera of these harvester ants. Some of them are all black, some of them are all red like this one, and some of them are black and red. So there's quite a variety of different kinds of harvester ants. Most of them are in 2 different genera. Velvet ants are not technically ants, they're wasps. So in the same order as ants, the females, which you see in the lower left, can sting. The females have no wings, so they're grounded. They look like a fuzzy, cute little ant, but don't pick them up because their sting is one of the most painful in the insect world. The males have wings, as you can see on the right. You don't see them as often. And they fly around looking for the females. Velvet ants. Some insects make galls, or they induce plants to make galls. This is an oak gall. You'll see some of these in the park on scrub oaks. This particular one is made by a tiny wasp. This wasp, which can't be small enough to fly through the eye of a needle, so we're talking a really small wasp here, will find its host plant, which in this case is an oak. It will lay an egg or inject an egg into the stem of the plant, also a chemical along with it, which will induce the plant into creating the gall. So the gall is kind of like a cancerous growth that is induced by the chemicals that the wasp injects. Inside the gall, as you can see, there'll be little nesting chambers. There's 4 eggs in this one, which will hatch into larvae, and then the larvae will complete their metamorphosis inside the gall and fly away. So watch for these various galls. Galls come in all shapes and sizes. Here's one that occurs on the creosote bush. When they first form, they're bright green. They blend right in with the foliage of the creosote. As they age, they turn brown and look like this in the lower left. So inside this gall, again, would be an egg, maybe a couple of eggs from a tiny little fly in this case, not a wasp. This one's actually induced by a small midge, what we call the creosote gall midge, tiny fly. Crane flies are super common. You see them in your house. They're one of the first insects to wake up in the late winter, early spring. They look like a giant mosquito, but they're not. They are a member of the fly order, though, Diptera, which means they only have 2 wings. The other 2 wings are formed into these little objects you see here called halteres. And they're sometimes called mosquito hawks, but that's also a misnomer because they don't eat mosquitoes. They just eat detritus and plant material and maybe sip a little nectar. So they're hardly feeding at all as an adult. And they're just flying around your house, doing no harm, but looking like a big scary mosquito. This is another fly you might see around the house or out and about as you're walking the trails, landing on the ground. It's called a robber fly. Notice how they hold their wings flat over their bodies, kind of folded, kind of a unique look. And these guys are actually good to have around because they consume house flies, like the one on the left is doing. They'll tackle these flies in mid-flight, and then they'll use their piercing, sucking mouth parts to suck these flies dry like a milkshake. So if you see one in your house, just leave it be, and it will help rid your house of pests, like house flies. It's called a robber fly. Cicadas usually come out later in the season when it gets a little more humid. So we're thinking July and August is when you really might start hear cicadas, especially in places like Arizona and Texas. But we have cicadas here too. Now our cicadas are not the what's called the periodic cicadas that you learned about that occur back east that only come out every 17 years or so, all at once. And then you won't see them for a long, long time. Our cicadas here in the West are what you call annual cicadas. So we always have some cicadas coming out every year. They don't time it so that they all come out once every 17 years, for example. So we always have a few cicadas buzzing around. It's one of the loudest sounds in the animal kingdom, actually, is the sound that the cicada makes by fast vibrating little armored plates that it has on its body. It vibrates these plates incredibly fast, and as they rub up against one another, they make this annoying and very loud buzzing sound. So here's a cicada actually emerging from the ground. They spend most of their life underground, and then they crawl up out of the ground, attach themselves to a stucco wall or the bark of a tree or lawn furniture, and then they split the back of their exoskeleton and the adult cicada emerges. So sometimes you'll catch this in action, or you'll find the discarded exoskeletons or exuvates of the cicadas still clinging to the side of your house. This white gooey stuff that you'll see on certain types of prickly pear cactus is actually caused by an insect. It's called a cochineal scale insect. So underneath all that white goo are the immature or nymph forms of this scale insect, and they exude this white frothy stuff around them to protect them from being preyed upon by birds like verdins, for example, that might like to eat them. And so if you were to crush one of these scale insects like this person in the lower left has done, you'll see it kind of bleeds a magenta or reddish color. And this is a natural dye that's approved by the FDA, and it's used in a variety of soft drinks and lipsticks and dyes for clothes. It's also said that the red coats dyed their coats using cochineal scale. So since this scale insect and the cactus that it lives on only occur in the New World, this was a very important export to the Old World. So now you'll find prickly pear cactus being grown in Europe and Asia and Africa just to raise the cochineal scale so that they can use the dye for all of those many uses. It's very important natural substance. Dung beetles are a member of the scarab beetle family. Now, we're not going to find big, giant dung beetles like this one here. This one's found in Africa. But we do have smaller versions of these dung beetles that are a little more common as you go east into Arizona. And instead of using elephant dung like they do in Africa, they'll use cow dung or other dung that they might find around, and they'll roll this dung into a ball, lay an egg on it, actually bury it completely under the ground, and then their young will have something to feed on, because there's a lot of good undigested food in these balls of dung. This 10-striped June beetle is pretty common in the area. Watch for it at porch lights. Makes a kind of a grating, squeaking sound if you annoy it, but it's essentially harmless. And it's also a member of the scarab family, so watch for that. Now here's an endangered beetle that is smaller than the previous one, and the stripes aren't quite as obvious. It's called the Casey's June beetle. It's found in the Palm Springs region around the Smoke Tree Ranch. So I wouldn't expect you to find this in Joshua Tree National Park. If you did, though, it's something to be aware of, because it is one of the few endangered species of insects in our region. And maybe you've heard about it. It's called Casey's June beetle. Unfortunately, a lot of these die in swimming pools in and around the Palm Springs area. Here's a beetle that's everywhere, and it's got a lot of nicknames, as you can see. Some people like to call them stink bugs. Well, they're not really true bugs, they're beetles. So maybe call them a stink beetle. But not all of them stink. Some of them just posture like they're going to stink, but they've got nothing to shoot out. Most of them, not all, but most of them are in the family Tenebrionidae, so I like to call them tenebrionid beetles. Many of them, again, not all, but many or most are in the genus Eleodes, so you could call them Eleodes beetles. I like to call them darkling beetles. I think it's a good generic name for this group of black beetles that have no wings and are grounded, and some members or species in this group do stink. There's a mouse called the grasshopper mouse that specializes in eating these stinky beetles, and it will stuff them into the ground rear end first and then bite their heads off to try to avoid eating the stinky part. Another beetle you'll see crawling around on the ground that cannot fly because its elytra are permanently fused shut is the desert spider beetle. They kind of look like black widow spiders with that small head and that bulbous abdomen, but they're actually beetles, and they exude a chemical on their backs which acts kind of like a sunscreen, and the pollen from the flowers gets trapped in this sunscreen-like material, and that's what causes some of them to look yellowish. Others will look black and yellow. Some will be all black. So it kind of depends on the individual. But you'll see these guys crawling around. Now they're members of the family Meloidae, the spider beetle family, and some members of this family produce a toxic chemical that oozes out of the joints of their legs. It's called cantharidin. So you want to be careful about picking up beetles, or in this case, not picking up beetles, because you could get a blistering effect. That's why they're called blister beetles too, from that chemical as it exudes from their leg joints. This is another beetle in that same group, the blister beetles. And when you see these bright, bright colors like this iron cross blister beetle, that's nature's warning that you probably should leave this beetle alone. Otherwise, you are going to get a mouthful of something poisonous. In this case, that cantharidin I was telling you about. So that's what we call aposematic coloration. When you see bright, bright colors in an animal, that's warning you to back off. I see these iron cross beetles, if I'm lucky, once a year. So it's always a special treat when you come across them up in the Joshua Tree region. So watch for them, but don't touch. This is a really big beetle that we see near Palo Verde trees and also in date groves down here in the Coachella Valley. It's called the Palo Verde root borer. It's often mistaken for a cockroach, but it's actually a beetle, a longhorn beetle with those long antennae. So they look scary. They're quite large, but you know, they're essentially harmless. I mean, they could nip at you a little bit with their mouth parts, but they really can't do any harm to you. And their young, or their larvae, as you can see here, are huge and can live underground for many, many years, maybe even up to 7 years, munching on the roots of Palo Verde trees and slowly undermining the tree. So when a big windstorm comes, it'll blow the tree over, and you'll see lots of these grubs and the beetles emerge because they've been chowing on the roots. Speaking of cockroaches, this is the big cockroach that you might be familiar with. It's called the American cockroach, but it's actually from Africa. It's a non-native cockroach, but it's well established in our desert area and quite large. We do have a native cockroach, which we can call the desert cockroach. So this little guy is a kind of a tan or translucent color and likes to live in sandy areas. So we see them around desert hot springs, Thousand Palms. Maybe in the more sandy areas of Joshua Tree National Park, you would find the desert cockroach. It's a native cockroach. Jerusalem crickets are more common in moist areas. So if you go towards Riverside and west from Riverside, you'll start to see more of these things. They do range up into Morongo Valley and Yucca Valley, maybe 29 Palms. There's a little bit more moisture in the high desert. We don't see them here in the low desert because it's just too dry. But they burrow underground. They're called Jerusalem crickets. They've got 6 legs, which makes them an insect. Giant mesquite bugs are fairly large, and they do like mesquite trees, so watch for them on these blooming mesquites. They're a member of the true bug family, which tend to have kind of a flattened back and this little upside down triangle right here called a scutellum. Here's another scutellum. This is another true bug called the kissing bug. They get that name because they do like to bite people on or near the lips where the skin is soft. They come out at night. Fortunately, they're not really common around here, and they don't carry terrible diseases like they can in the tropics. If you were to be bitten by one here, you might have a reaction, but it's probably not going to cause you great harm. They do like piles of debris. Every time I watch the TV show Hoarders, I kind of think of these kissing bugs because they like debris that hasn't been moved in a long time, and I find them sometimes in wood piles that haven't been touched in a while either. So this is the cone-nosed kissing bug. Another true bug, since we're talking about hemipterans with that upside down triangle there, the scutellum, this is the giant water bug. This one also has an incredibly painful bite, I've read, and one you would want to avoid touching if you see it. They live in the water, which is why they're called water bugs. They're also called toe biters. So another reason not to wade in the water without some water shoes on. And at night, they'll come out and fly around and are attracted to lights, like this one was. This actually was taken in Arizona, this photo, at a porch light. Giant water bug. Dragonflies are common around the park and can range widely. Even though they're born in the water, they're aquatic. Once they reach the adult stage, they feed on a lot of mosquitoes and can range 6 miles or more from water. We've got a number of species in and around Joshua Tree National Park. Dragonflies and damselflies are closely related. They're both members of the same order, but they belong to different suborders. Dragonflies, as you can see on the left, have these big heads and big bulbous compound eyes, and they like to hold their wings perpendicular to their body. Damselflies, on the other hand, have much smaller heads and smaller eyes. Their bodies aren't as thick, they're more dainty, and they like to hold their wings folded over their bodies. Here's another true bug called a leaf-footed bug. So you can see there's a little swelling on the lower part of the leg that gives them the name leaf-footed bugs. There's that little triangle called the scutellum. And that flattened appearance makes them a true bug, hemipteran. This moth is sometimes mistaken for a bat. I actually showed it in the bird PowerPoint, you may recall. It's called the black witch. It's actually a type of noctuid moth, one of our most common moth families in and around the park. And this is one of the larger noctuids you'll ever see. You can see how big it is in this photo here. So again, watch for the black witch to show up at your porch light one night, especially in the fall. It tends to fly a little more in the fall compared to the spring. And most of them, if not all of them, are born in Mexico and then wander across the border and show up here sporadically. The white-lined sphinx moth is very common in the spring, especially when we have good rain and we have a lot of brown-eyed primrose. That's one of its favorite food plants that it lays its eggs on. These moths are active both at night and also during the day. And sometimes they will hover like a hummingbird in front of a flower, and that's why some people call them hummingbird moths. This one has a great name. It's called the glorious squash vine borer. It's a clear-wing moth. You can see right through the wings. Clear-wing moths tend to be day-flying moths. So not all moths fly at night. This is one of the exceptions. Its food plant happens to be coyote melon. So wherever you see coyote melon growing, you might find the glorious squash vine borer. The larva will feed on the roots and stems of the coyote melon plant. This rarely seen beetle is called the palm boring beetle. It has a unique association with native palm trees, Washingtonia foliifera. So any place where there's palms, cottonwood, for example, you might be lucky enough to see one of these palm boring beetles. They only emerge, the adults, or come out for a very brief window, probably in mid-May to mid-June would be the best chance to see one. Most of their life they spend inside the palm as a grub, just munching on the inside of the palm tree. And that will go on for years until they finally complete their metamorphosis and bore out the side of the palm, leaving a big bullet-sized hole in the side of the palm tree where they've bored out. Yeah, one of the most special stories that you can tell in Joshua Tree is the story of the yucca moth and the yucca plant. And of course, Joshua trees are a type of yucca. So this is a story I guess every Joshua Tree park ranger should know and be familiar with. But we've got a few of these yucca moth species in the area, maybe up to 5 different species. All of these yucca moths have associations with yucca plants. Some are more closely associated with a particular species than others, but they all associate with yuccas. There's 1 and maybe 2 species that have a particular association with the Joshua tree. I'll give you a quick version of the story here because it takes too long to tell it all, but the female has specialized mouth parts. You can see them coiled up here. And she will go into the flower of a blooming Joshua tree. She will uncoil these mouth parts and then use them to scrape out a big ball of pollen. She'll then take that ball of pollen and fly to a completely different yucca plant that's in bloom. She'll climb into the flower once again, and this time she will unpack the ball of pollen and stick it onto the female part of the flower, the pistil. And that will ensure that the Joshua tree then is pollinated. She'll also lay some of her eggs inside that flower chamber, and then she will die. And her eggs will hatch, and the tiny larvae, the tiny little caterpillars that live inside the yucca flower, will then feed on the seeds that result from the successful germination of the yucca plant or the Joshua tree. So this moth has a vested interest in ensuring that Joshua trees are properly pollinated and produce seeds. Otherwise, her own young will starve. Now, of course, there's plenty of seeds produced. The young yucca moths, the larvae, only consume a few of them, and there's plenty of seeds then left over for the Joshua tree to carry on future generations. So it's kind of a win-win story. It's probably the best example around of mutualism, which is a type of symbiosis, one of these very close relationships between two organisms. Monarchs, which I talked about on a previous bird slideshow, occur and migrate through the park, especially in the late winter. And they feed on milkweed. So anything we can do to encourage the planting of native milkweed is a good thing for monarchs, because that's the only place they're going to lay their eggs. Monarchs are being proposed to be put on the endangered species list because their numbers are really at a record low. So they need all the help they can get. You won't see viceroys too much in this area, but they do occur in the west, and they resemble monarchs, as you can see. Here's a monarch again, and here's a viceroy. And it's an example of what we call Batesian mimicry in the animal kingdom. You get one species that mimics another for protection. In this case, the story goes that the viceroys are not as noxious tasting as the monarchs are, because they don't feed on milkweed. And so a typical predator would avoid a viceroy because they think it's one of those foul-tasting monarchs. More recent studies into this are slightly changing that story, but for now I'll stick with it. The most common butterfly any time of the year is the painted lady, and that's because their caterpillars will feed on a variety of food plants. They're not that picky. And so if one plant's not available in a certain year, they can use other ones to suffice. They're more of a generalist. Great purple hairstreaks feed exclusively on mistletoe. So anywhere in the park where you see mistletoe growing, you'll want to look for the great purple hairstreak. It has false tails to resemble the head, trying to trick a bird or other predator into biting the tail off and not the head. And I think this is the last slide, actually. This is the California Dogface butterfly, which actually is the official state insect of California. So if you didn't know it, California and most states have these long lists of official this and official that. And in this case, this is the official state insect, the California Dogface. In the male, you can see that there's a profile here that looks like a dog. I used to think it looked like a duck, but then I took a closer look, and now I think it looks like a standard poodle. So I'm good with the dog face thing. The female looks a little different. She's just plain. She doesn't have the dog face. And a lot of this family, it's called Pieridae, the whites and the sulfurs, feed on mustard. So wherever there's mustard, both native and non-native, you might find sulfurs, and you might find the dog face. So watch for it. And I guess we'll open it up now to questions. So maybe you've been building up some questions. We'll see what you've got. Thank you for listening, and feel free to contact me anytime at all. It's not a bother. And send me your pictures and all of your questions about bugs and birds and anything to do with desert natural history. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. I'm very excited to start looking for some of these that I didn't know. And folks do have some questions. First question, do kissing bugs fly?
Yes, kissing bugs do fly.
Yeah, I think I've seen them on the screen before. And what are the benefits of cockroaches?
Well, they certainly, when you look at the food chain, they provide food to a lot of other animals. So yeah, food chain alone, they're incredibly important. A lot of things that we eat eat cockroaches, I hate to remind you.
Can you be more specific?
Well, I'm thinking of chickens right off. I know my kids eat a lot of chicken nuggets, and I'm thinking of those chickens. They'll eat all kinds of things, including cockroaches. Full of protein.
Cool. Question about the palm borers. Can they kill the palm trees?
Good question, and it certainly isn't good for the palm tree to have a whole mess of these things inside of them. So I would say that they strain the palm tree and maybe shorten its life, but outright killing it quickly, no, I don't think that's happening.
Okay. What information can you give us about the golden huntsman?
That sounds like a spider. I don't know. I'd have to kind of look that up. Huntsmans are spiders that are predatory, I believe, on other spiders and other insects. And I think there's a wide variety of huntsmen in our area, but I can't really say more than that. I have to look it up.
Yeah. Well, and I have been examining the screens in this room, and I'm so disappointed not to see any potter wasp urns. So I myself am wondering, is there something I can do in my yard to encourage potter wasps?
Well, like these other mud daubers, they need water to make their pots. So, you know, putting out a bird bath, or, you know, if your neighbor has a swimming pool or something, these are all going to help your chances of having them construct those little pots in your neck of the woods. But water's the key. You know, they need water and mud.
Okay, we can make that. Will the Palo Verde borers kill the Palo Verde trees?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, they can undermine the tree, and you know, after years of chewing on the roots, like I said, it just takes one good windstorm to come along, and next thing you know, that Palo Verde's on the ground. And then if you look at the roots, you'll see that they're just eaten up. So eventually they'll undermine the tree, but they won't outright kill it. It'll take a number of years usually.
Oh, and we have either a comment or a question about harvester ants and whether the queens were flying in recent days, or when we would see queens flying.
Yeah. Good question. I don't know the exact timing of that. I would guess usually things like that are triggered by rains. So if we were to get some kind of spring rain happening, the combination of rain and heat, I think, would be something that might trigger a flight. That would be my best guess.
Rain plus heat.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that is all the questions I see right now.
Good. Again, just, you know, if you think of something later, whoever's still listening, just email me and ask away. I'm here.
Lots of people, or everyone is still listening, I got to say, and now the questions just started piling up again.
Yeah, all right.
Can you tell us about the leafcutter ants south of Cottonwood?
Okay, did somebody find leafcutter ants down there? I'm presuming.
Apparently.
If they're true leafcutter ants, which are more tropical in nature, then they're going to be harvesting certain leaves, bringing them back to their underground chambers, and then growing fungus on the leaves, and then actually feeding on the fungus instead of on the leaf material themselves. The reason we don't normally have leafcutter ants here in the desert is because it's too hot and too dry, and it's not a good, you know, climate for fungus growth. But maybe there's a species that has snuck in. I'd have to find out about it. I don't know if it's been introduced or it found its own way here, and maybe it's feeding on fungus.
To me,
I don't know.
you need pictures. Do you need a picture of the ant, the home?
Well, whoever's got the information on that, I mean, please send it to me. I'd like to read the story or the article or the study or the picture or whatever. I want to know more. Yeah. But normally you go down into Mexico or you go down to Costa Rica, and that's when you really see these leafcutter ants in action. And remember, our harvester ants aren't eating fungus. Our harvester ants are actually eating the plant material itself. Yeah.
Okay,
Next.
is there a way to deter the Palo Verde borers that won't damage other insect life for the plants?
Yeah, I don't know. Good question. I'd say do a little more research on the Palo Verde root borer and find out which Palo Verde trees they prefer. I bet they have their favorites, and then plant the ones they don't like, maybe. And if you do have the kind of Palo Verdes that they prefer, you know, you may just have to just deal with it. I mean, it's just nature's way. They're native. Just plant a lot of Palo Verdes so that if some of them get undermined, you'll always have some in good shape.
But not in a row along the prevailing wind stream, I guess.
Yeah, that might be good advice.
Okay.
Well, Kurt,
Well,
thank you for being here today. And thank you to our audiences. Our next webinar will be on Wednesday, May 6th with Ruth Nolan, who will be speaking on her book, Fire in the Mojave, Stories from the Deserts and Mountains of Inland Southern California. And in the afternoon, Candace Weber and Kurt Leuschner will be speaking on how to identify animal burrows. Until then, please stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.